We're no stranger to St. Mark, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, authors of the Gospels, the good news. We think Mark started his Gospel around 67, the earliest of the Gospels, and the shortest of the Gospels. Like the other evangelists, we believe that Mark started his Gospel with the story of the crucifixion. So he started at the end and then went forward. And with that, he's proclaiming the death of Jesus, that's recorded right here, and of course, subsequently, his resurrection. This quote from Mark today takes place in memory on the evening of Easter. So even though we're not celebrating the Mass for Easter, we always celebrate Easter, it's every day's event. The Gospel of Mark, chosen by the Church for his celebration of his feast, is the Easter Gospel, Jesus sending us into the world, proclaiming the good news. And then he ascends out of their sight. So it's the combination of Easter, the ascension, and the mission of the apostles being sent. So it's a very encouraging feast day. Mark became a bishop in the early church. He moved to Alexandria, which is Egypt, and there established a community, but he was eventually martyred, hence the red vestments. He was martyred by a rope tied around his neck, and he was dragged through the streets, probably by a cart, until he died. When he died, the story goes that his body was taken and preserved, and then eventually, and I don't know how this happened, it wound up in Venice. How it happened probably is very easy to figure out. During the Middle Ages, when the Crusades had happened throughout Europe, and of course the Holy Land, Mark's body was preserved, not incorrupt, but just preserved in a tomb someplace. And I gotta say, the Italian Crusaders said, we need Mark on our land. With that in mind, they brought the body of Mark to St. Mark, and it became St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. And if you go online, you can see beautiful pictures of this magnificent cathedral basilica in his Mark. Piazza San Marco is the area right outside of the basilica. Mark's gospel is the shortest gospel. And in it, Jesus moves, because it's a short gospel, from one spot to another. I mean, not geographically, but by literature. He's here, then he's there, and in a matter of a few pages, he said his whole gospel. So in the 3rd century, when St. Augustine was attributing the 4 signs around the throne of God that we hear from the book of Apocalypse, the lion, the man, and they all have wings, so they're all angelic, the ox, and the eagle, he took each of those symbols and associated each one with one of the Gospels. Mark became the lion, with the idea that it was short, it was sweet, and lions move very quickly. Like cats, they move very quickly from one spot to another. Just a symbol, just a way of remembering Mark and his Gospel. So it's good to stop and realize that we use these Gospels every day. It's not only readings from Scripture, it's the good news, it's Gospel. So when Mark records something, we stand up and listen, literally stand up, because it is the Gospel. Now, we don't have many references to Mark, except that he was the author. And in Peter's letter to the early Christians, he mentions Mark, just the church and the chosen one, Babylon, sends you a greeting, as does Mark, my son. Greet each other with a loving kiss. So Mark is mentioned there. One 4 letters. I don't know how many letters it is in Hebrew, but just quickly. And he followed Peter on his journeys. Now, this letter is attributed to Peter, or written in the ideas of Peter, okay, which is not a pseudonym, but something like a pseudonym. It's not really his, but when they wrote it in the theology and the believing system of Peter. And of course, when people received it, knowing that Peter was the inspiration for it became very important and got into the scriptures when they canonized the scriptures. So here, Peter, one of the early apostles, who could have been dead by now at this point, says, Mark is with us and we send our love. That might not make a big difference from one perspective, but from the other perspective, how personal. It's a letter that mentions our friend Mark. Not much about him. Eventually we know that he died as a martyr. But Peter, head of the apostles, writing to us about how to live. And what does he say? Clothe yourself with humility in your dealings with one another. Oh my goodness, if our politicians learn that, and you know what? All of us are meant to learn that. To deal with each other humbly instead of showing off. And that happens a lot. People like to show off. People like to brag. And everybody likes to talk a little bit, so knock your socks off. Talk about yourselves to each other. But we have to be humble enough to listen as well. A friend of mine recently reminded me, that's why God created us with one mouth and 2 ears, so we can hear before we speak. And I think it's a great gift that comes to us from the scriptures, from the Holy Gospel. And of course, we have Mark to thank for that. So today we celebrate Mark, our evangelist brother. We celebrate his gospel, and we celebrate our faith in Jesus Christ, the risen Lord.